Most people think the hardest part of building wealth is making $1 million. They're wrong. The hardest part is making the first 100,000. And not because of the number itself, but because of what you're fighting against when you have almost nothing. You are not fighting the market. You are not fighting inflation. You're not even fighting your boss or your salary. You are fighting gravity. And gravity at this stage is invisible, constant, and almost impossible to feel until it's already pulling you back down. This is what no one tells you when you're starting out. Everyone talks about compound interest like it's magic. Everyone draws the curve that bends upward. But they skip the part at the beginning of that curve, the part that looks completely flat, the part where you work harder than you've ever worked, save more than you've ever saved, and feel like nothing is happening. That flat part has a name. I call it the dead zone. The dead zone is not a failure of effort. It is a feature of the system. It is mathematically unavoidable. And if you don't understand why it exists, you will interpret it as a signal to quit right before the moment everything was about to change. Here's what's actually happening during those early years. When your net worth is close to zero, every dollar you earn has to fight on two fronts simultaneously. It has to cover your life: rent, food, transportation, the basic cost of existing in the world. And then whatever remains, whatever small fraction survives that first battle, has to be converted into capital, into something that will eventually work for you instead of just through you. The problem is that at this stage, those two battles are almost perfectly matched. Your income and your expenses are locked in a kind of war of attrition. And capital, real compounding capital, can only be built from the surplus, from what's left after the war. And in the beginning, that surplus is almost nothing. Think about it this way. Imagine you're trying to roll a snowball up a hill, but the hill is covered in sand. Every step forward, the sand shifts. The snowball barely holds its shape. You push harder, you gain a little ground, and then the sand moves again. People watching from a distance think you're doing something wrong. You think you're doing something wrong. But the truth is, you're not doing anything wrong. You're just still on the sand. The physics haven't changed in your favor yet. And here is where psychology enters the equation, because the human brain was not designed to endure this phase. Our minds are wired for feedback, for signal, for reward. We need to see results that match our effort, or we begin to lose confidence. We begin to doubt the strategy. We begin to look for shortcuts, not because we're lazy, but because the absence of visible progress triggers the same neurological response as failure. The brain cannot distinguish between nothing is happening yet and this is not working. They feel identical. They produce the same cortisol, the same doubt, the same quiet erosion of commitment. This is the invisible trap inside the dead zone. You don't quit because you gave up. You quit because your own nervous system told you that continuing was irrational. And in a world designed for instant feedback, where every app, every purchase, every social interaction returns an immediate signal, the slow, silent accumulation of capital feels almost pathological. It feels like something is broken. Nothing is broken, but the system is designed to make you feel that way. Now let's talk about the mathematics, because this is where the real explanation lives. If you save $500 a month and invest it at a reasonable return, it takes roughly 14 years to reach $100,000 through savings alone. 14 years. Most people hear that and feel despair. But that number is actually a misunderstanding of how this works. Because the goal was never to save your way to $100,000. The goal is to reach the threshold, the point at which capital begins doing meaningful work. At $10,000 invested, the market's annual return is roughly $800. That is less than $70 a month. You can barely feel it. At $50,000, that same return becomes $4,000 a year. You begin to notice it, but it still feels small. At $100,000, it becomes $8,000 a year, nearly $700 a month. And something fundamental shifts. The capital is now covering a real portion of your expenses. It's no longer symbolic. It's structural. It has crossed the line from a number on a screen to a force in your financial life. This is what I call the activation point. The moment when compound interest stops being a concept and starts being a coworker. Someone working alongside you, quietly, every hour of every day, whether you're awake or asleep, whether you're working or resting. Before the activation point, you are the only engine in your financial life. After it, you have a second engine, and that second engine never gets tired. Charlie Munger said it first, and I have repeated it my entire life. Getting to the first 100,000 is a matter of intellectual and moral discipline. Not talent, not luck, not access. Discipline, because at this stage, the math is unforgiving. There is no shortcut through arithmetic. You must earn, you must save, you must invest. And then you must wait. Not passively, actively wait. Waiting while protecting the surplus. Waiting while resisting the 100 different voices telling you to spend, to enjoy, to reward yourself for how hard you've been working. Those voices are not wrong, by the way. You have been working hard. You do deserve to enjoy your life, but there is a version of enjoyment that costs you the activation point. And once you understand what the activation point means, you begin to see every unnecessary purchase differently, not as a deprivation, as a trade. You are trading your future engine for a present comfort. And sometimes that trade is worth it. But you should make it with full awareness, not with the unconscious blindness that the system encourages. Because here's the thing about the system, and I mean the entire architecture of modern consumer life. It was not designed to help you reach the activation point. It was designed to keep you just below it. Every upgrade, every subscription, every product launched at exactly the price point that consumes your surplus, these are not accidents. Lifestyle inflation is not a personal failing. It is a gravitational field engineered by some of the smartest people alive, calibrated to the exact size of your raises and bonuses, designed to expand at precisely the rate your income grows. If you receive a 10% raise and your expenses grow by 10%, you have experienced the illusion of progress without any of its substance. Your life has changed in form, but not in structure. The dead zone has simply grown wider. Breaking out of this requires something that is difficult to teach, but essential to develop. I call it surplus consciousness. It is the constant, quiet awareness of the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and the discipline to treat that gap as sacred. Not because money is sacred, but because what that gap represents is sacred. It represents time. It represents future freedom. It represents the version of your life where decisions are made from choice rather than necessity. Most people live their entire lives making decisions from necessity. They take jobs they don't want because they need the income. They stay in situations they've outgrown because leaving requires capital they don't have. They accept terms they would never accept if they had options. And the tragic thing is that they often believe this is simply the shape of life, that this is how it works for everyone, but it is not the shape of life. It is the shape of life without capital. And capital is not a luxury. At the level we're discussing, $100,000, it is the minimum threshold for financial agency. So what does the path through the dead zone actually look like? It looks like this. You find the highest income your current skills can produce, not the income you wish you had, but the real number available to you right now. Then you construct your life around a spending level that is significantly below that income, not uncomfortably below it. The goal is a surplus you can maintain for years, not a sacrifice that breaks you in months. Then you automate the investment of that surplus so that the decision is removed from the equation entirely. You don't rely on willpower every month. You remove the choice. The surplus moves automatically the moment the income arrives, before your mind has a chance to negotiate with it. And then you increase your income. This is the part that separates the people who escape the dead zone from the people who stay in it. Cutting expenses alone will not get you there fast enough. The math doesn't work. You need the numerator to grow. You need to be relentless about developing skills, creating value, positioning yourself for better opportunities. Not someday, but concurrently while the surplus is building. Because income growth is the multiplier. It is what shortens the 14 years to 7 or 4 or 2. Not luck. Competence, deliberately developed. And throughout all of this, throughout the entire long game of the dead zone, you must protect something that cannot be measured in dollars. You must protect your belief in the process when the process produces no visible reward. This is the hardest part. Not the math, not the discipline, the belief. The ability to look at a flat line and see with absolute clarity that the curve is coming. That the physics are changing, that every dollar you protect and invest is quietly moving you closer to the threshold, even when it feels like nothing is moving at all. There is a version of you that quits at $40,000 because the progress feels invisible. There is a version of you that quits at $70,000 because something went wrong and the number dropped back to 50 and the discouragement felt unbearable. And there is a version of you that stays, that understands what those numbers represent, that sees the dead zone not as evidence of failure, but as the price of admission, the unavoidable terrain that everyone who built real wealth had to cross. Warren Buffett crossed it. Charlie Munger crossed it. Every person who ever reached the activation point crossed it, not because they were exceptional, but because they understood something about the nature of the game that most people never learn. They understood that the early years are not about results. They're about building the engine. And the engine, once built, changes everything. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Think about the version of your life 10 years from now. Not the fantasy version, the real version, the one you're actually building right now with the decisions you're actually making. Is that version crossing the threshold? Is it reaching the activation point? Or is it still in the dead zone? Not because the math won't work, but because no one ever explained that the flat line at the beginning of the curve is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. The most expensive thing in most people's financial lives is not a house or a car. It is the moment they quit, right before the physics were about to change in their favor. Time does not negotiate. It does not wait while you figure this out. Every year spent below the activation point is a year the second engine wasn't running. And the second engine, once running, does not catch up quickly. It catches up exponentially, which means every year of delay is not a linear cost. It is a compounding cost. It echoes forward through every year that follows. The first 100,000 is hard. It was supposed to be hard. The difficulty is not a flaw in the system. It is a filter. The people who understand what they're building, who see past the flat line to the curve that follows, those people cross the threshold. And when they do, when they finally reach the activation point and feel the second engine come online, they all say the same thing. They say, I wish I had started earlier. Not, I wish it had been easier. Earlier. Because they understand, with the clarity that only comes from the other side, that the difficulty was never the obstacle. The only real obstacle was not knowing what they were building and why and what it would feel like when it finally began to work. Now you know,